Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a plunge into a really epic story. It's the 500-year history of the world's reserve currencies
Right.
and, the rise and fall of the empires that backed them.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. We've pulled together the sources you shared, and they give us this incredible long view, half a millennium,
Mm.
looking at how global power has shifted and, maybe more importantly, what happened to money and wealth during those huge transitions.
Right. So our mission today is basically to go through these sources together. We want to unpack the most important insights, spot those repeating patterns across the centuries, and really figure out what lessons this deep history holds for us right now.
Exactly. The sources really paint this picture of dominant world orders rising up, structuring global trade and finance around their own currency, and then eventually giving way to the next one. It's a cycle we see again and again.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should probably start right at the beginning of the story the sources tell, way back with the Age of Discovery. What do your sources highlight about Portugal's role there?
Well, the sources point to Portugal as really the first genuine global maritime power. This is back in the 15th century. They were the pioneers, setting up trade routes everywhere. And Lisbon, their capital, became this pivotal global trade hub because of it.
And their currency, the Portuguese escudo, kind of emerged from that.
Yeah, specifically their gold cruzado coins. Now, it wasn't a formal global reserve currency like we think of today, but the escudo became a sort of de facto international money during that age of discovery. It was just widely accepted across trading posts.
But even that early on, your sources suggest there were already signs of strain for Portugal.
Definitely. What jumps out is Portugal's inherent limitations. It was a pretty small country, limited manpower. Just maintaining those incredibly far-flung colonies, and especially the crucial spice routes, put this immense strain on their resources. They were, basically overextended pretty early on.
And I guess bigger rivals started noticing.
Precisely. You had larger emerging powers like Spain, and then later England and the Netherlands starting to encroach on Portugal's monopolies and territories. And then that political union with Spain after 1580, that really kind of sealed their fate as an independent global power.
Right. I could see how they would intensify the competition.
Oh, it did. By the late 16th, early 17th centuries, you see naval defeats mounting up for them. The Dutch, for example, seized key ports like Malacca in 1641. Now, that wasn't just a battle. For Portugal, that was pretty much the end of their incredibly profitable spice trade monopoly, a really clear signal that power was shifting hands.
Okay, so if you were a savvy merchant, or maybe a noble back then, and you're seeing Portugal's dominance start to fade, how did you protect your wealth? What do the sources say?
Well, the key strategy that gets highlighted is diversification. Smart merchants didn't keep everything tied up just in Portuguese ventures or the Escudo. They started funding or partnering in ventures with those other rising powers, Spain, the Dutch, the English. They were shifting capital to where the future seemed to be heading.
So getting exposure to the next potential winners. Smart.
Exactly. And crucially, holding real assets was absolutely key. Things like the spices themselves, gold, silver, land. These were concrete stores of value that weren't solely dependent on the fate of the Portuguese crown or the value of its specific coin. The sources actually suggest this period saw the emergence of early forms of portfolio diversification, spreading risk beyond just one kingdom or one trade route. Those who started shifting capital or partnered with the rising Spanish, Dutch, or English, well, they positioned themselves to prosper in the next era.
Which brings us neatly into the Spanish era, roughly 1530 to maybe 1640. And suddenly Spain is the world's preeminent empire, powered by something huge.
Immense is the word. The sources really emphasize the sheer scale of gold and silver just flooding in from their colonies in the Americas. This wasn't just wealth. It fundamentally reshaped global finance.
And their currency became the global currency.
It really did. The Spanish real, the Ocho, that's the famous piece of 8 silver coin, it became the unquestioned global trade currency, accepted across Europe, the Americas, even deep into Asia for well over a century. Spain had completely overshadowed Portugal.
That felt like that dominance would last forever, but history shows it didn't. What were the signals? The first signs that Spain's golden age was maybe starting to tarnish.
Well, what really jumps out from the sources is just the sheer fiscal strain they were under. The Habsburg rulers, they were constantly fighting wars, and they just amassed these enormous debts. King Philip II's regime, it's notorious, defaulted on its debts not just once, but multiple times. 1557, 1560, 1569.
Wow, multiple times. Repeated national bankruptcies. That sounds devastating for confidence.
Oh, absolutely cratered their financial credibility. Yeah, 1575 and 1596 too, and it had real-world consequences, even contributing to triggering the Dutch revolt. Alongside that debt, you had the infamous price revolution. That flood of New World silver, while making Spain rich on paper, also caused persistent high inflation right across Spain and Europe. Prices rose something like sixfold between 1500 and 1650.
Making their own goods uncompetitive, I imagine.
Exactly. It significantly undermined their domestic industries. In a way, having all that easy bullion wealth maybe removed the pressure to innovate economically. So you've got crippling debt, lost credibility from defaults, and this debilitating inflation. Pretty classic warning signs.
And you can add military overreach to that list, too.
Definitely. These costly conflicts on multiple fronts just drained the treasury. The disastrous Spanish Armada campaign against England in 1588. That wasn't just a military loss, it was a clear signal their naval supremacy was vulnerable. And that long, drawn-out war in the Netherlands was just a constant, massive financial drain. By the mid-17th century, they'd lost the Dutch provinces, and even Portugal broke away again in 1640. That really marked the end of their era of unchallenged power.
So around 1640, we're seeing this clear transition point emerge in the sources.
Precisely. As Spain was struggling with debt and war, the Dutch Republic was just rapidly rising. They had a more agile navy, they were pioneering financial innovations. The Spanish real started losing its grip, and the Dutch guilder stepped in as the new dominant currency for trade and finance. And the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 really solidified this shift, recognizing Dutch independence and confirming that power had migrated north.
So for investors or traders during Spain's decline, what were the smartest moves to protect their wealth, according to the sources?
Well, again, the sources emphasize shifting to hard assets. Holding physical gold and silver bullion was essential. It preserved value against Spain's currency troubles and that rampant inflation, unlike holding Spanish paper IOUs or even coins that were sometimes debased. And lenders, those tied too closely to the Spanish crown, learned some very harsh lessons from those defaults. More cautious bankers diversified their exposure.
Right. Don't lend too much to a sovereign that keeps defaulting. Lesson learned.
A painful one for some, I bet. And importantly, forward-looking traders started reallocating capital to those emerging Dutch and English ventures. Investing in the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, became a prime example. Its equity and bonds were backed by this rising economic powerhouse centered in Amsterdam. So the pattern is clear. Diversify away from the over-leveraged, declining power. Put assets into more stable or rising regions.
Which brings us right to the Dutch era, roughly 1640 to 1720, often called their Golden Age.
Yeah, a truly remarkable period highlighted in the sources. The Dutch Republic, despite being geographically small, became this global giant. They were maritime innovators, they had a uniquely capitalist culture for the time, and they pioneered financial tools we still use today. They essentially created the world's first proper stock exchange and the blueprint for multinational corporations like the VOC. Amsterdam became the undisputed financial center of the world.
And the Dutch guilder became the currency of this new order. Your sources even call it the first modern reserve currency, accepted beyond just the physical metal.
That's right. It wasn't just about gold or silver coins anymore. The guilder itself, the banknotes, the credit lines, they were trusted and used internationally. It absolutely dominated commerce in Europe and beyond. The Dutch era completely supplanted Spanish dominance. But like all empires before and after, its time at the very top was finite.
Okay, so what signals did the sources pick up on that the Dutch Golden Age was starting to fade?
A big one was naval and colonial competition, primarily from England and France, who were growing stronger. Those Anglo Dutch wars in the mid-17th century were fierce. They really showed Britain's rising capabilities at sea. By the early 1700s, Britain's navy and its colonial reach were pretty clearly overtaking the Dutch, especially after some key victories secured Britain's strategic naval bases and trade advantages around the globe.
So rivals weren't just catching up, they were actually starting to surpass them in key areas.
Yes. And domestically, you started to see some stagnation and growing financial strain in the Netherlands. Other nations, especially Britain, were successfully copying the Dutch financial models. London began competing directly with Amsterdam's capital markets. The Dutch government itself accumulated significant debt from these continuous wars, particularly against Louis XIV's France. By the late 18th century, they found it increasingly difficult to finance both military spending and maintain their high standards of living, that classic guns and butter problem playing out.
The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War seems like a real turning point mentioned in the sources.
It really was, from 1780 to 1784. Britain's stronger finances and larger navy just decisively defeated the Dutch. It devastated Dutch commerce and triggered a financial crisis back home that effectively ended the Dutch Republic's status as a great power.
And economically, others were simply industrializing faster by then.
Correct. The Dutch economy, while still prosperous, just grew more slowly than its rivals. They had a smaller population, fewer resources compared to the expanding empires of Britain and France. And what's fascinating, and a key pattern we see repeating, is that capital even began flowing out of the Netherlands. Dutch bankers started lending heavily to Britain throughout the 18th century, essentially financing British expansion. Now, while that was profitable for the bankers themselves,